The incense rose in slow spirals through the morning air at Karnak, its fragrance carrying prayers toward heavens that the Egyptians believed watched over every aspect of existence below. Priests moved through columned halls, whose surfaces blazed with painted images of gods and kings, their chanting creating rhythms that had echoed through these spaces for centuries before and would continue for centuries after. The Nile flowed past in its eternal course, its waters bringing the life that made civilization possible, in a land where rain rarely fell, and the desert pressed close against the narrow ribbon of green that human effort maintained. Thebes stood as the religious heart of an Egypt that had recently emerged from generations of foreign domination into a new era of power and confidence. The Hyksos rulers who had controlled the northern delta had been expelled within living memory, their defeat ushering in the dynasty that would carry Egypt to heights of influence it had never previously achieved. The 18th dynasty had begun with warriors who reclaimed their homeland through campaigns that restored Egyptian pride along with Egyptian territory. The kingdom they rebuilt would become the greatest power the ancient world had yet seen. Into this world of renewal and expanding ambition, a daughter was born to the pharaoh Thutmos I and his great royal wife Amos. The child, who entered the world around 1507 BC, received a name that announced the divine associations her parents intended her to carry: Hatshepsut, meaning foremost of noble women. The title proved prophetic in ways that no one witnessing her birth could have anticipated, though the circumstances of her arrival already marked her as exceptional among the women of her time. Her father had risen to the throne through merit and marriage rather than birth alone, his military capabilities having proven themselves in campaigns that extended Egyptian power further than any previous pharaoh had achieved. Thutmose I had led his armies south into Nubia, pushing the frontier beyond the Fourth Cataract into territories whose gold and exotic goods would enrich Egypt for generations. He had marched north as well, reaching the Euphrates River and establishing Egyptian influence in lands that had never before acknowledged pharaonic authority. The king, whose blood would flow through Hatshepsut's veins, was a conqueror whose achievements demanded respect throughout the known world. Her mother, Amos, carried credentials equally impressive for purposes that Egyptian royal ideology considered essential. The queen's bloodline connected to the ruling family through channels that made her daughter's claim to royal status unimpeachable by the standards that legitimacy required. In a culture where the purity of royal descent mattered enormously for theological reasons that intertwined kingship with divine order, Hatshepsut's maternal ancestry provided foundations that her father's achievements had constructed upon different grounds. She was royal on both sides, in ways that would later prove crucial to the claims she would make. The palace complex at Thebes, where the princess spent her earliest years, combined the functions of government with the requirements of royal household in arrangements that had evolved over dynasties of experimentation and refinement. Courtyards opened onto gardens, where pools reflected skies that rarely saw clouds, their surfaces disturbed only by lotus blossoms and the occasional movement of fish, whose colors rivaled the paintings on surrounding walls. Servants moved through corridors with the quiet efficiency that training had perfected, their presence maintaining environments whose comfort befitted the living gods who inhabited them. The concept of divine kingship that Hatshepsut absorbed from her earliest awareness shaped understanding of her father's role and, eventually, her own potential in ways that modern minds find difficult to fully comprehend. The pharaoh was not merely a ruler governing through human authority, but an embodiment of Horus on earth, the living connection between the mortal realm and the gods who sustained cosmic order. His actions maintained Ma'at, the principle of truth, justice, and proper arrangement that kept chaos at bay and allowed existence itself to continue. The rituals he performed, the monuments he built, the justice he dispensed, all served purposes that transcended ordinary politics to touch the fundamental structure of reality. Hatshepsut's brothers died young, their passing leaving her as the senior surviving child of the great royal wife, whose offspring carried the purest claims to royal status. Egyptians' succession did not follow the strict primogeniture that later kingdoms would practice, but the position of eldest royal daughter carried weight that death had concentrated in this single surviving princess. Her father's other children by secondary wives held places in the royal household, yet none could match the legitimacy that her mother's blood provided. Circumstances were quietly arranging possibilities that required only time and opportunity to manifest. Education for a princess of her standing combined the practical skills that royal women needed with exposure to the religious and administrative knowledge that her position made relevant. She learned to read the hieroglyphic script, whose symbols carried meanings both phonetic and symbolic, their combinations capable of expressing everything, from mundane inventories to the most sacred hymns. Tutors instructed her in the histories that recorded her ancestors' achievements, the theological frameworks that explained divine relationships, and the protocols that governed behavior appropriate to her station. The temples that dominated Thebes became familiar to her through participation in rituals whose complexity required years to master fully. Karnak's vast precincts housed the cult of Amun, whose importance had grown as Thebes rose from provincial town to imperial capital. The god's identification with the ruling dynasty, creating bonds that enriched both temple and throne. Hatshepsut's title as God's wife of Amun, which she held from an early age, granted access to sacred spaces and ceremonial roles that few women could claim. The position brought her into the heart of religious life with a regularity that shaped her understanding of power's relationship to piety. Hathor received particular devotion from the young princess, the goddess's associations with music, joy, femininity, and royal women creating natural connections that deepened through years of worship. The cow-eared deity, whose image appeared throughout Egyptian religious art, represented aspects of divine femininity that Hatshepsut would later invoke when constructing her own claims to legitimate rule. The relationship between this princess and this goddess would eventually find expression in architecture that still stands after 35 centuries of desert winds and human history. The Nile's annual flood marked time in patterns that had governed Egyptian life since before the pyramids rose at Giza. Each summer, the waters swelled with rains that fell far to the south, in mountains that Egyptians knew only through the bounty those rains eventually delivered. The inundations spread across the valley floor, depositing the fertile silt that made agriculture possible without the irrigation systems that other civilizations labored to maintain. When the waters receded, planting began in soil whose richness seemed miraculous to peoples less favored by geography. Hatshepsut's childhood unfolded within these rhythms, her years marked by cycles that connected human existence to cosmic processes that her religion taught her to revere. The palace women who surrounded her during these formative years included figures whose influence shaped her character in ways that formal education could not replicate. Nurses, attendants, and the wives and daughters of officials created a female world within the larger court whose customs and relationships followed patterns distinct from those governing men's interactions. The skills of managing households, navigating social complexities, and wielding the informal influence that women in patriarchal societies often develop. These capabilities grew through observation and practice in environments that the historical record barely illuminates. Her father's campaigns continued shaping the empire that she would eventually rule, each expedition extending frontiers or consolidating control over territories that previous advances had claimed. The treasure that flowed into Egyptian coffers from Nubian gold mines, Levantine trade routes, and tribute rendered by peoples who acknowledged pharaonic superiority, funded building programs that transformed temple complexes and royal monuments throughout the kingdom. Hatshepsut witnessed this wealth arriving at court, understood its sources through education that explained how empire functioned, and absorbed lessons about the relationship between military power and material prosperity. The question of succession grew more pressing as Thutmose I aged, and the absence of surviving sons by his great royal wife became a problem requiring solution. His heir would be Thutmose II, a son born to a secondary wife named Mutnefret, whose status fell below Queen Amosi's, but whose male child represented the best available option for continuing the dynasty. The solution that Egyptian royal practice had developed for such situations required the heir to marry a woman whose bloodline would legitimize children whose paternal ancestry alone could not. Hatshepsut, as the senior royal daughter, represented exactly such legitimizing potential. The marriage that awaited her was not a matter of choice, but of duty that her upbringing had prepared her to accept. Egyptian royal siblings had married each other for generations, the practice serving theological purposes that connected the pharaoh to divine models where brother-sister unions were common among the gods. The personal dimension of such arrangements remained subordinate to the political and religious functions they served. Individual feelings accommodated where possible, but never permitted to override necessities that dynastic survival imposed. The Theban hills that rose beyond the cultivation's edge would eventually receive her body for eternity, their valleys already holding the tombs of pharaohs, whose examples she would one day far exceed. The cliffs that glowed gold and rose in the setting sun concealed spaces that craftsmen were hollowing for royal burials, whose treasures would attempt to provision the dead for journeys through the afterlife. Hatshepsut could see those hills from palace windows, their presence a constant reminder of the mortality that awaited even the living gods who ruled from Thebes. The princess who walked through Karnak's columns and sailed upon the Nile's waters during these years was preparing, though she could not have known it, for a destiny that would shatter every precedent governing what women could achieve in the ancient world. The education she received, the titles she accumulated, the connections to divine power that her religious roles established, all were creating foundations for an edifice whose construction awaited only the opportunities that time would provide. The foremost of noble women was becoming something that no noble woman had been before, her transformation unfolding so gradually that those witnessing it failed to recognize its revolutionary implications until the revolution was complete. The marriage ceremonies that united Hatshepsut with her half-brother Thutmose II unfolded through rituals whose antiquity stretched back beyond memory into the mythological time when gods had established the patterns that humans followed. Priests intoned formulas that bound the royal couple in arrangements serving purposes far beyond personal union, their words invoking divine witnesses whose approval legitimized what was occurring in the mortal realm. The incense that rose through temple chambers carried prayers toward heavens that the participants believed genuinely watched over the proceedings, their fragrant spirals connecting earthly ceremony to cosmic significance. Thutmose II brought to the throne capabilities that his father's military reputation overshadowed without entirely obscuring. The young pharaoh had grown up in the shadow of a warrior king whose campaigns had extended Egyptian power to distances that seemed almost mythological, his own achievements inevitably measured against standards that few successors could hope to match. His mother, Mutnofret, had been a secondary wife, whose status placed her son in the royal succession without providing the pure legitimacy that marriage to his half-sister was designed to supply. The arrangement that made Hatshepsut his great royal wife served dynastic purposes that both parties understood and accepted. The queen who emerged from these ceremonies occupied a position whose influence exceeded what most royal women could claim. Great royal wife was not merely a title of honor, but a functional role carrying responsibilities that ranged from religious duties to administrative involvement that proximity to the pharaoh permitted. Hatshepsut participated in festivals whose calendrical observance maintained the cosmic order that Egyptian theology placed at the center of royal responsibility. She appeared alongside her husband in ceremonies whose imagery would later decorate temple walls, her presence affirming the legitimacy that her bloodline provided to children their union might produce. Egypt, during these years, enjoyed the fruits of her father's conquests, without facing the costs that active warfare imposed. The frontiers that Thutmos I had established held secure under his successor's watchful maintenance, their garrisons preventing the incursions that might have required the kind of military response that the new pharaoh seemed less inclined to undertake than his predecessor had been. Tribute flowed from Nubia and the Levant, with the regularity that demonstrated Egyptian dominance remained unquestioned, its arrival enriching temples and treasuries throughout the kingdom. The administrative machinery that governed Egypt hummed with the efficiency that generations of bureaucratic development had perfected. Scribes tracked the grain that taxation collected, the labor that corvée obligations provided, the goods that trade and tribute delivered from territories near and far. Officials whose families had served the throne for generations continued the work their ancestors had performed, their expertise ensuring continuity that individual reigns could not disrupt. Hatshepsut observed these systems functioning, her education having prepared her to understand mechanisms whose complexity foreign observers found astonishing. A daughter named Neferure arrived from the royal union, her birth demonstrating that the marriage was fulfilling at least one of its intended purposes. The princess who entered the world, carrying her parents' combined bloodlines, represented the dynasty's future in ways that would prove significant as events unfolded. Hatshepsut's relationship with this daughter would deepen through years, when political circumstances made female connections within the royal family particularly important. The bond between mother and child strengthening as other relationships proved less reliable. Thutmos II conducted at least one military campaign into Nubia during his reign, the expedition addressing disturbances that required the pharaonic response that Egyptian ideology demanded when subject peoples challenged the order that conquest had established. The inscriptions commemorating this campaign credited the king with victories that restored proper submission among populations whose rebellion had briefly threatened the stability that empire required. Whether the pharaoh personally led his forces or delegated command to generals whose expertise exceeded his own, the official record attributed success to the throne whose authority military action served. The king's health apparently troubled those close to him in ways that contemporary records did not explicitly document but later evidence suggested. Examinations of his mummified remains would eventually reveal a man whose physical condition may have limited the vigorous activity that warrior pharaohs typically undertook. Whatever ailments he suffered, they did not prevent him from performing the ceremonial duties that kingship required, or from fathering the children whose existence proved his capacity to continue his line. Yet the brevity of his reign, perhaps 13 years, perhaps fewer, suggested that his hold on life was never entirely secure. A son named Thutmos arrived, though not from Hatshepsut's body. The boy who would become Thutmos III was born to a secondary wife named Iset, whose status fell far below the great royal wife's, but whose male child represented something that Hatshepsut had not provided. A male heir whose gender matched the expectations that millennia of tradition had established for pharaonic succession. The infant who would eventually become Egypt's greatest military pharaoh entered the world with claims that his father's position guaranteed and limitations that his mother's status imposed. The death of Thutmos II came with relative suddenness that left arrangements incomplete and questions unresolved. The pharaoh who had maintained his father's empire without dramatically extending it passed into the afterlife, leaving an heir whose age precluded independent rule. Young Thutmose III was perhaps 2 or 3 years old when his father died, his understanding of the responsibilities he had inherited non-existent, his capacity to perform the duties that kingship required years away from developing. Egypt faced a regency whose management would determine whether the dynasty survived the crisis that royal mortality had created. Hatshepsut assumed the role of regent with a naturalness that her preparation had made possible and circumstances had made necessary. The great royal wife, whose bloodline legitimized the child, Pharaoh's claim possessed the education, the religious authority, and the court connections that effective regency required. Her title as God's wife of Amun provided spiritual credentials that complemented the political position her marriage had established. The officials whose cooperation governance required accepted her leadership with the pragmatic recognition that alternatives were either absent or worse. The regency that began as temporary expedient gradually revealed itself as something more substantial. Hatshepsut governed in her stepson's name with competence that earned respect from administrators whose experience allowed them to recognize capability when they encountered it. Decisions that the child pharaoh could not make fell to the regent whose judgment determined their outcome. The signatures and seals that authorized official actions increasingly reflected her will, expressed through mechanisms that preserved the fiction of the young king's authority, while the reality of power concentrated in her hands. Temple reliefs from these years show Hatshepsut in the traditional posture of a queen supporting her sovereign, her position behind and slightly smaller than the pharaoh she served. Yet the frequency of her appearance and the prominence of her depiction suggested significance that conventional queenly imagery did not typically convey. Artists working under direction that she influenced were beginning to represent her importance in ways that pushed against the boundaries of what precedent permitted. The visual vocabulary that would eventually depict her as pharaoh was developing through incremental innovations, whose cumulative effect transformed representation along with reality. The religious responsibilities that had been hers since childhood expanded as her political authority grew. Rituals that the pharaoh should have performed but could not due to age fell to the regent whose priestly titles authorized her participation in ceremonies that masculine kingship normally monopolized. She made offerings to Amun in his sanctuary at Karnak, her hands presenting gifts that maintained the reciprocal relationship between God and throne upon which Egyptian prosperity depended. Each ceremony she performed accumulated precedent that later bolder claims would invoke. Officials whose loyalty regencies typically tested found in Hatshepsut a leader whose competence rewarded their support, and whose growing power promised continued advancement for those who recognized where authority actually resided. Senmut emerged during these years as a figure whose influence would eventually exceed what any non-royal Egyptian of his era achieved, his talents finding scope in service to a regent whose ambitions required capable instruments. The partnership that developed between the queen and her steward would produce monuments that still astonish visitors 35 centuries after their construction. Hatshepsut rose to the position of high priest of Amun, his elevation reflecting both personal capability and the regent's recognition that controlling the kingdom's most powerful religious institution served purposes that secular authority alone could not achieve. The temple, whose wealth rivaled the thrones, whose priesthood numbered in the thousands, whose theological pronouncements shaped how Egyptians understood their world. This institution's leadership now supported Hatshepsut's position with enthusiasm that practical calculation and perhaps genuine conviction combined to produce. The young Thutmose III grew through these years in circumstances whose complexity later apologists would find difficult to characterize fairly. His regent was also his stepmother, his claim to rule theoretical while her exercise of power was actual, his future uncertain while her present dominance was undeniable. Whether he experienced these arrangements as protection or as usurpation would depend on perspectives that maturity would develop through processes that childhood could not accelerate. For now, he remained a symbol whose significance exceeded his agency, a pharaoh in name whose kingdom was governed by another. The two lands, Upper and Lower Egypt, united under single rule since the legendary Menes had joined them at the dawn of dynastic history, experienced these years as a period of calm prosperity that effective governance produced regardless of its unconventional source. Harvests followed the Nile's flooding, with the reliability that proper administration of irrigation systems ensured. Trade flowed through routes that peace kept open, and official encouragement kept profitable. Temples received the support that royal piety traditionally provided, their construction projects employing craftsmen whose skills produced beauty that served theological purposes alongside aesthetic ones. Hatshepsut's position was evolving through stages that contemporaries may not have fully recognized until the transformation was complete. She had been princess, then queen, then regent, each role preparing her for the next while, remaining within boundaries that tradition had established for women of royal blood. But the boundaries were beginning to blur. The precedents were being reinterpreted, and the power that Regency had concentrated was suggesting possibilities that no Egyptian woman had previously dared to pursue. The daughter of Thutmose I was preparing to become something that would require new categories to comprehend. A woman who ruled not through or beside a king, but as king herself. Pharaoh, in fact, as well as function. The moment of transformation approached through preparations that unfolded across years of careful positioning. When it came, the change would seem both revolutionary and inevitable. Revolutionary, because nothing like it had occurred in Egypt's long history. Inevitable, because everything Hatshepsut had done since assuming the regency had pointed toward exactly this outcome. The foremost of noble women was about to become the foremost of all Egyptians, her ascent to the throne completing a journey whose destination had perhaps been visible only to her until the moment she claimed it for all to see. The transition from regent to ruler unfolded through stages whose gradual progression made each step seem less radical than the cumulative transformation they produced. Titles accumulated like stones building a wall, each addition strengthening the structure, while individually appearing modest enough to escape the opposition that sudden change might have provoked. Hatshepsut was not seizing power through the dramatic gestures that usurpers typically employed, but rather growing into it through processes that her supporters presented as natural development of a role she was already performing. The religious justification that would legitimate her unprecedented claim began taking shape in theological narratives whose audacity matched the political transformation they were designed to support. Artists and priests working under direction that Hatshepsut's inner circle provided developed the story of her divine conception, a narrative depicting the god Amun himself, visiting Queen Amos in the form of Thutmos I, his divine essence mingling with her mortal body to produce a child whose nature was therefore partially divine. The reliefs that would eventually display this story at Deir el-Bahri announced that Hatshepsut's right to rule derived not merely from human ancestry, but from the direct intervention of Egypt's supreme deity. Amun's oracle provided the public pronouncement that transformed private preparation into acknowledged reality. The god's statue, carried by priests during a festival procession at Karnak, moved in ways that those present interpreted as divine selection of Hatshepsut for kingship. Whether the movements reflected genuine divine will, priestly manipulation, or the subtle influence of those carrying the sacred image, the effect was the same. Egypt's most powerful god had publicly designated a woman as pharaoh, and who could question what Amun himself had declared? The oracle became the foundation upon which all subsequent claims rested, its authority invoked whenever legitimacy required reinforcement. The coronation ceremonies that formalized what the oracle had announced drew upon rituals whose antiquity stretched back to the earliest dynasties. Hatshepsut received the crowns that symbolized rule over the two lands: the white Hedjet of Upper Egypt, the red Deshret of Lower Egypt, and the double Shent that combined them into a single expression of unified sovereignty. Priests placed upon her the crook and flail that pharaohs had wielded since time beyond memory, their crossed placement against her chest marking her as the shepherd and provider of her people. The ceremonies unfolded through hours of ritual, whose every gesture carried meaning that centuries of repetition had sanctified. Her throne name announced the theological program that would characterize her reign: Matkare, meaning truth is the soul of Re. The choice connected her directly to the sun god, whose daily journey across the sky represented the cosmic order that pharaohs existed to maintain. Mayat, the principle of truth, justice, and proper arrangement, became the defining concept of a reign that would emphasize construction over conquest, prosperity over military glory, and the building of monuments whose survival would demonstrate that proper order had been maintained during the years she held power. The visual representation of a female pharaoh posed challenges that artists resolved through compromises, whose inconsistency modern observers sometimes find confusing. Hatshepsut appeared in royal regalia that tradition had designed for male bodies: the Neem's headdress covering her hair, the false beard projecting from her chin, the male kilts replacing the dresses that queens conventionally wore. Yet the texts accompanying these images sometimes retained feminine grammatical forms, the pronouns and adjectives acknowledging a biological reality that the imagery simultaneously denied. She was depicted as a man while being described as a woman, the contradiction apparently troubling Egyptians less than later cultures might expect. The body that inhabited these masculine trappings remained female, though the artistic conventions of pharaonic representation made this less visually apparent than modern sensibilities might assume. Egyptian royal art had always prioritized symbolic meaning over naturalistic depiction, its purpose being to convey theological truths rather than physical appearances. The Hatshepsut, who appeared on temple walls and in sculptural portraits, was an idealized figure, representing kingship itself, rather than a particular individual whose personal features deserved accurate recording. The male attributes she adopted were costumes of office rather than claims about anatomy. Thutmos III remained nominally co-regent throughout Hatshepsut's reign, his theoretical kingship never formally abolished even as her practical sovereignty became complete. Temple reliefs occasionally showed both figures, their joint representation suggesting a partnership that the actual distribution of power rendered largely fictional. The young man, who had been a child when his stepmother assumed the regency, was growing toward adulthood, in circumstances whose peculiarity he could hardly have avoided recognizing. His eventual response to these years would shape both his reign and Hatshepsut's posthumous reputation. The officials who had supported Hatshepsut's rise continued their advancement as her rule solidified. Senmut accumulated titles that eventually numbered more than 80, his influence extending across domains that included stewardship of royal properties, oversight of construction projects, and tutorship of the Princess Neferua. The intimacy that his position required sparked speculation that ancient and modern observers alike have found irresistible, though evidence for any relationship beyond professional collaboration remains circumstantial at best. Whatever personal dimensions their partnership may have possessed, its public expression focused on the monuments that his administrative genius helped her vision produce. Hatshepsut maintained his position as High Priest of Amun, his support ensuring that the religious establishment, whose approval Hatshepsut's legitimacy required, continued endorsing her rule. The theology that explained how a woman could occupy the throne received elaboration and propagation through channels that temple authority controlled. Priests throughout Egypt heard justifications for arrangements that their predecessors could never have anticipated, their acceptance facilitated by the benefits that royal favor showered upon institutions whose cooperation the crown required. Nihasi rose to prominence as a military commander, whose loyalty Hatshepsut valued highly enough to entrust with responsibilities that her reign's signature achievement would require. The expedition to Punt that would become the most celebrated accomplishment of her rule would depend upon leadership that combined logistical competence with diplomatic sensitivity. Nehesi's preparation for this role proceeded through the early years of Hatshepsut's reign, his capabilities developing through assignments that tested his readiness for the greater challenges ahead. The young Neferura occupied a position of unusual prominence for a royal daughter, her visibility in official imagery suggesting importance that exceeded what princesses typically received. Her mother may have contemplated succession arrangements that would continue female rule into the next generation, Neferua's preparation potentially paralleling what Hatshepsut's own youth had provided. The title God's Wife of Amun that the princess held connected her to the religious authority that had supported her mother's rise, its bestowal perhaps anticipating a future when similar support would be required again. Egypt, beyond the palace, experienced Hatshepsut's early reign as a period of prosperity that competent governance and continued peace combined to produce. The agricultural systems that the Nile's flooding sustained functioned with the efficiency that proper administration ensured, their yields supporting populations whose comfort demonstrated that Ma'at was being maintained. Trade routes that her father's conquests had opened remained active under her watchful encouragement, their traffic bringing goods from distant lands whose exotic nature emphasized the reach of Egyptian influence. The military establishment that Thutmos I had built and Thutmos II had maintained continued serving under a pharaoh whose gender did not prevent recognition of the strategic realities that frontier security required. Garrisons held positions that earlier campaigns had established, their presence deterring the challenges that weakness would have invited. Some limited military actions occurred during these years. Operations in Nubia to maintain control over gold-producing regions, possible expeditions into the Levant to remind subject peoples that Egyptian attention had not lapsed. The female pharaoh's reign was not entirely peaceful, though peace rather than war characterized its dominant theme. The building programs that would become Hatshepsut's most enduring legacy began taking shape during these years of consolidation. Plans developed for monuments whose scale would announce the permanence of arrangements that skeptics might have considered temporary expedients. The sites selected for major construction, Karnak, where Amun, whose oracle had chosen her, received worship, and the bay of cliffs across the river, where her mortuary temple would rise, reflected theological programs that architecture was designed to express. Stone would proclaim what words alone could not secure, the monument's survival serving purposes that outlasted the individual reign that produced them. Craftsmen throughout Egypt found employment in projects whose demands stimulated industries that royal patronage sustained. Quarries produced the stone that construction consumed in quantities that earlier reigns had rarely matched. Artisans whose skills had passed through generations of family training applied techniques that produced beauty-serving sacred purposes. The economic activity that building generated spread prosperity through networks that connected quarry workers to sculptors, boat builders to temple administrators, in webs of interdependence that royal initiative activated. The theological innovations that Hatshepsut's reign required were becoming normalized through repetition that transformed the unprecedented into the accepted. A generation was growing up for whom female pharaonic rule represented not revolutionary disruption, but simply the way things were. Officials who had begun their careers under her authority knew no other arrangement, their loyalty directed toward the ruler who had advanced them rather than toward theoretical alternatives whose advantages remained abstract. Time was converting innovation into tradition, each year that passed, making what had seemed impossible increasingly appear inevitable. The woman who wore the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt had achieved something that would not be replicated for over 1,000 years, until Cleopatra took the throne in circumstances entirely different from those Hatshepsut had navigated. She had claimed power not through the foreign conquest that brought Cleopatra's Ptolemaic ancestors to Egypt, nor through the chaos that sometimes elevated unlikely candidates, but through the systematic development of legitimacy that patience and preparation had constructed. The foremost of noble women had become the foremost of all Egyptians, her transformation complete, her reign ready to produce the achievements that would justify the audacity of her claim. The years ahead would demonstrate what a female pharaoh could accomplish when opposition had been managed and support had been secured. The monuments would rise, the expeditions would sail, and the prosperity would deepen until Hatshepsut's reign became proof that effective rule depended upon competence rather than gender. The two lands watched as their unprecedented sovereign prepared to show them what her vision could create. The Egypt that flourished under Hatshepsut's mature rule enjoyed blessings that the gods seemed to shower upon a land whose governance pleased them. The Nile rose and fell with the regularity that proper administration of cosmic relationships was believed to ensure. Its floods neither disastrously excessive nor dangerously insufficient, during years when royal attention to ritual maintained the balance that agricultural prosperity required. Granaries filled with surpluses that careful management accumulated against lean years, that planning could not prevent, but foresight could survive. The two lands experienced a golden age whose memory would persist long after the ruler who produced it had passed into eternity. Administration under Hatshepsut achieved an efficiency that reflected both the competence of officials she selected and the attention she devoted to governance that less engaged rulers might have delegated entirely. The bureaucratic systems that generations of scribes had developed functioned with precision that royal oversight enhanced without micromanagement that would have hindered capable administrators. Taxation fell upon those able to bear it with fairness that prevented the resentment which excessive extraction produced. The temples that served as both religious centers and economic institutions received support proportioned to their importance without favoritism that would have disrupted the delicate balance among competing priesthoods. The priesthood of Amun naturally enjoyed particular royal attention, given the role that God's oracle had played in legitimizing Hatshepsut's claim to the throne. Karnak received endowments whose scale announced gratitude that theological justification had earned, while also ensuring continued support for arrangements that the temple establishment's cooperation made sustainable. Yet other cults were not neglected. The gods throughout Egypt received recognition that maintained the relationships between divine powers and earthly governance, that Egyptian religion considered essential to cosmic stability. Foreign relations proceeded through diplomatic channels that Hatshepsut's temperament apparently preferred over the military expeditions that her father and eventual successor both favored. Embassies arrived at Thebes from lands whose rulers recognized Egyptian supremacy without requiring the periodic demonstrations of force that previous pharaohs had considered necessary. The tribute that flowed from Nubia and the Levantine territories continued uninterrupted, its regularity demonstrating that the transition to female rule had not weakened the empire's capacity to enforce the obligations that conquest had established. The expedition to Punt that departed Egyptian ports around year 9 of her reign represented the signature achievement through which Hatshepsut chose to demonstrate her kingdom's power and her own capability as pharaoh. This was not a military campaign designed to terrify enemies into submission, but a commercial and diplomatic venture aimed at renewing connections that had lapsed during generations when internal troubles had distracted Egyptian attention from distant trading partners. The land of Punt had supplied Egypt with exotic goods since the Old Kingdom, its precise location debated by scholars, but its importance to Egyptian luxury consumption never questioned. Nihasi received command of an expedition whose scale announced the importance that Hatshepsut attached to its success. 5 ships departed from ports on the Red Sea coast, their construction having required the transport of materials across the desert that separated the Nile Valley from eastern waters. The vessels that rode the swells toward their distant destination carried goods intended for exchange alongside the soldiers and sailors whose presence ensured that trading would proceed on terms favorable to Egyptian interests. Months of voyage lay ahead, through waters whose navigation demanded skills that generations of Egyptian seafarers had accumulated. The coastline of Punt eventually rose from tropical seas, whose warmth exceeded anything Egyptian waters provided, its settlements visible as the fleet approached harbours, where trade had occurred in ages beyond memory. The inhabitants who gathered to greet the arriving Egyptians displayed the physical characteristics and cultural practices that reliefs at Deir el-Bahri would later immortalize in images whose ethnographic detail still fascinates modern observers. These were not enemies to be conquered, but partners whose cooperation Egyptian diplomacy was designed to secure. King Pharaoh ruled this distant land with authority that Egyptian sources acknowledged through the respectful treatment his depiction received. His wife Ati accompanied him in imagery that artists recorded with a realism unusual for Egyptian conventions, her distinctive body shape preserved in reliefs whose honesty suggests genuine observation rather than formulaic representation. The royal couple of Punt received Egyptian envoys with hospitality that facilitated the exchanges both parties sought, their negotiations producing agreements whose terms satisfied everyone involved. The goods that Egyptian ships carried homeward transformed the expedition from diplomatic success into commercial triumph. Myrrh trees, carefully dug with their root balls intact, would be transplanted to Egyptian soil, their survival promising future harvests of the incense that religious ceremonies consumed in quantities that foreign import alone could not economically sustain. Living trees had never before made such a journey. Their transport representing innovation that Hatshepsut's ambition had inspired and Egyptian ingenuity had achieved. Incense and ebony, gold and ivory, exotic animals and precious woods filled holds that settled lower in the water as cargo accumulated. Baboons and monkeys destined for royal menageries traveled alongside materials destined for temple workshops, where craftsmen would transform raw imports into finished goods worthy of divine offerings. The wealth returning to Egypt justified every cost the expedition had incurred, while providing propaganda that Hatshepsut's artists would exploit for maximum political effect. The fleet's return occasioned celebrations whose enthusiasm reflected genuine appreciation for what the expedition had accomplished. Hatshepsut herself received the treasures that Nehesi's successful command had secured, her inspection of goods providing scenes that temple reliefs would preserve for audiences stretching across millennia. The myrrh trees were planted in the terraces of the mortuary temple, then under construction, their survival allowing the pharaoh to claim that she had brought Punt itself to Egypt, rather than merely bringing Punt's products. The restoration of monuments damaged during the Hyksos period provided another focus for Hatshepsut's constructive energies during these prosperous years. The foreign rulers who had controlled northern Egypt for over a century had allowed temples to decay, and in some cases had actively damaged sacred sites whose theology conflicted with their own religious preferences. The scars of occupation remained visible generations after liberation, their persistence a reproach to pharaohs who had not yet completed the healing that national pride demanded. Hatshepsut undertook repairs, whose scope demonstrated both the resources her treasury commanded and the piety that her religious program emphasized. Temples throughout Egypt received attention, proportioned to their damage and their importance. Craftsmen laboring to restore what foreign neglect or hostility had allowed to deteriorate. The inscriptions commemorating these restorations credited the female pharaoh with accomplishments that connected her to the great builders of earlier dynasties, while distinguishing her from the Hyksos, whose legacy she was erasing. The artistic production that flourished under royal patronage achieved levels of sophistication that later periods would struggle to match. Sculptors working in the hard stones that Egyptian tradition favored for royal portraiture created images whose technical excellence reflected the resources that peaceful prosperity made available. The Hatshepsut portrayed in these works displayed the serene confidence that effective rulers projected, her features idealized according to conventions that emphasized eternal qualities rather than individual peculiarities. Painters whose skills decorated tomb and temple walls developed techniques that pushed the boundaries of what two-dimensional representation could achieve. The reliefs depicting the Punt expedition demonstrated narrative capabilities that earlier Egyptian art had rarely attempted, their sequential scenes telling a story whose geographical and temporal scope exceeded anything comparable from previous reigns. The artists who created these works were innovating within traditions whose conventions they respected, their achievements demonstrating that traditional forms could accommodate new content without abandoning the aesthetic principles that made Egyptian art distinctive. The economy that supported this cultural flourishing drew strength from sources that Hatshepsut's policies cultivated without dramatic innovation. Agriculture remained the foundation upon which everything else rested, its yields dependent on the Nile's cooperation and the administrative efficiency that ensured irrigation systems functioned properly. Trade supplemented agricultural wealth with goods that Egypt could not produce domestically. The Punt expedition, representing the most spectacular, but hardly the only commercial venture that royal encouragement promoted. Mining operations in Nubia and Sinai extracted the gold and copper that Egyptian industry consumed, their output sustained by labor forces whose management required administrative attention that central government provided. The gold that flowed from southern mines enriched temples and tombs with the yellow metal that Egyptians associated with divine flesh, its abundance during Hatshepsut's reign contributing to the monuments whose gilded elements dazzled visitors with reflections of sunlight that symbolized the god's presence. Craft production employed specialists whose skills had accumulated through generations of training, that family traditions preserved and royal workshops refined. The objects that these artisans created ranged from the monumental sculptures that required teams of workers laboring for years to the delicate jewelry that individual craftsmen produced for elite customers whose wealth made luxury accessible. The quality that characterized work from Hatshepsut's reign reflected both the resources prosperity provided and the standards that royal patronage encouraged. The military establishment that Thutmos I had built and subsequent reigns had maintained continued serving purposes that Hatshepsut's peaceful inclinations did not entirely neglect. Garrison forces held positions along frontiers whose security required visible presence, even when active threats remained minimal. Training continued, preparing soldiers for campaigns that current circumstances did not require, but future developments might demand. The pharaoh, whose reign emphasized construction over conquest, understood that the peace permitting her building programs depended upon military capabilities, whose maintenance she did not neglect. Some military operations did occur during these years, their scale modest compared to her father's campaigns, but sufficient to demonstrate that female rule had not made Egypt weak. Nubian territories that periodically tested Egyptian control received reminders that rebellion would be suppressed with the efficiency that professional military forces guaranteed. Levantine regions, whose loyalty required occasional reinforcement, witnessed Egyptian forces whose presence confirmed that the empire's reach remained undiminished. These were police actions rather than wars of conquest, their purpose maintenance rather than expansion. The prosperity that Hatshepsut's reign produced created conditions favorable for the monumental construction that would become her most enduring legacy. The resources were available, the workforce was not required for military campaigns, and the administrative machinery functioned with efficiency that made ambitious projects feasible. The temples and obelisks, the terraces and colonnades that would proclaim her achievements for millennia were rising from foundations that these years of peaceful accumulation had made possible. The female pharaoh, who had claimed power through unprecedented assertion, was justifying that claim through accomplishments that masculine rulers would have envied. Her expedition had reached distant Punt. Her restorations had healed the scars of foreign occupation. Her administration had produced prosperity that filled granaries and treasuries alike. The audacity of her claim to the throne was being vindicated by the competence of her exercise of the power that claim had secured. Now she would demonstrate what that power could build when directed by vision that matched the resources her success had accumulated. The cliffs that rose beyond the western bank of the Nile at Thebes had received royal burials since the Middle Kingdom, their valleys and slopes offering the combination of security and sacred geography that Egyptian funerary traditions required. The bay of rock that curved beneath the peak, associated with the goddess Meretseger, already sheltered the mortuary temple of Mentuhotep II, the pharaoh who had reunified Egypt after the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. Hatshepsut chose this location for her own monument to eternity, her temple rising beside her predecessors in dialogue across 5 centuries of dynastic history. The structure that would emerge from this site required vision that only Hatshepsut could provide, an execution that only Senmut could deliver. The partnership between pharaoh and steward had deepened through years of collaboration, whose intimacy speculation has embroidered beyond what evidence can confirm. Whatever personal dimensions their relationship may have contained, its public expression focused on projects whose scale demanded the combined resources of royal authority and administrative genius. The temple they created together would justify whatever trust Hatshepsut had placed in the man whose capabilities made her ambitions achievable. Senmut brought to the task qualifications that his remarkable accumulation of titles reflected without fully conveying. His positions numbered more than 80 by the peak of his influence, their range encompassing responsibilities from stewardship of royal estates to oversight of construction projects to tutorship of the Princess Neferura. The breadth of his authority suggested competence that transcended any single domain, his capabilities proving themselves across challenges that would have overwhelmed less gifted administrators. The temple rising at Deir el-Bahri would become the supreme demonstration of what those capabilities could achieve. The design that emerged departed from conventions that previous mortuary temples had established, while respecting principles that Egyptian sacred architecture required. 3 terraces rose against the cliff face in ascending levels, connected by ramps whose gentle slopes invited processional movement toward the sanctuary, carved into the living rock at the structure's rear. Colonnades lined each terrace with rows of pillars, whose rhythmic spacing created play of light and shadow that shifted through the daily progression of the sun across the sky. The name given to this complex, Jeseru, meaning Holy of Holies, announced the sacred significance that every element of its design was intended to convey. The adjacent temple of Mentuhotep II provided inspiration that Hatshepsut's architects acknowledged while surpassing. The earlier structure had pioneered the terraced form that the new temple would perfect, its influence visible in basic conception, even as execution demonstrated how completely the student had exceeded the teacher. The dialogue between the 2 monuments created a conversation across time that connected Hatshepsut to the great reunifier of Egyptian history. Her temple's superiority, announcing that her achievements warranted comparison with the most celebrated rulers of the past. The reliefs that decorated the temple's walls served purposes that combined artistic beauty with political propaganda and religious devotion. The Punt expedition received detailed depiction in scenes whose narrative sophistication exceeded anything Egyptian art had previously attempted. The journey from departure through arrival and exchange to triumphant return, unfolding across wall surfaces that functioned as illustrated chronicles. The exotic landscapes of Punt, the distinctive appearance of its inhabitants, the goods that Egyptian ships carried homeward, all found representation in images whose accuracy suggests eyewitness observation translated through artistic conventions. The divine birth narrative received equally prominent display in reliefs that announced the theological justification for Hatshepsut's unprecedented rule. Amun's visit to Queen Ahmose unfolded through scenes that depicted divine intention manifesting in human conception, the god's selection of the vessel through which his daughter would enter the world, presented with the dignity that sacred subject matter required. These images made visible claims that words alone could not adequately convey, their presence in the mortuary temple ensuring that visitors for eternity would understand the divine sanction that legitimized everything Hatshepsut had accomplished. Hathor received particular devotion in a chapel whose placement within the temple complex reflected the goddess's importance to Hatshepsut's religious program. The cow-eared deity, whose associations included music, joy, femininity, and the protection of royal women, had commanded the pharaoh's worship since childhood, their relationship now finding architectural expression in spaces dedicated to rituals that would continue as long as the temple stood. The Hathor Chapel's decoration included images of the goddess suckling Hatshepsut, the intimate gesture conveying divine nurture that supported claims of special relationship between this pharaoh and this deity. The sanctuary carved into the cliff at the temple's highest level housed the cult statue through which Amun's presence would be invoked during festivals that brought the god's image across the river from Karnak. The beautiful festival of the valley, celebrated annually, saw Amun's statue carried in procession to visit the mortuary temples of deceased pharaohs, the journey maintaining connections between the living god and the dead kings who had served him. Hatshepsut's temple was designed to receive these visits with appropriate magnificence, its spaces proportioned to accommodate the processional rituals that the festival required. The terraces themselves supported gardens whose plantings transformed bare stone into living landscape. The myrrh trees brought from Punt found their permanent home in these spaces, their survival fulfilling Hatshepsut's boast that she had transplanted Punt itself to Egyptian soil. The incense they produced would supply the temple's ritual needs, while their presence announced the success of the expedition that had acquired them. Other plants supplemented the myrrh trees in arrangements that created green spaces, whose contrast with surrounding desert emphasized the life-giving power that royal patronage could command. Karnak received attention that rivaled what the mortuary temple consumed. The great temple of Amun, whose oracle had sanctioned Hatshepsut's rule, deserving elaboration that gratitude and continued political necessity both demanded. The obelisks that she raised within the temple precinct announced her devotion through monuments whose scale exceeded anything previous pharaohs had achieved. Twin shafts of red granite rose to heights that made them the tallest obelisks Egypt had yet produced, their golden tips catching sunlight that transformed them into beacons visible across the Theban landscape. The transport of these massive stones from the quarries at Aswan to their final positions at Karnak required logistical coordination, whose complexity challenged even Senmut's organizational capabilities. Barges designed specifically for the task carried granite shafts weighing hundreds of tons down the Nile during the flood season, when high water permitted navigation that would have been impossible during drier months. The journey covered over 100 miles through currents whose management demanded seamanship that generations of practice had refined. The arrival at Thebes occasioned celebrations whose enthusiasm reflected genuine appreciation for what the successful transport had accomplished. The erection of obelisks, once delivered, posed challenges that the transport itself had merely prepared. Engineering techniques whose details modern scholars still debate raised vertical shafts from horizontal positions through methods that combined mechanical ingenuity with massive application of human labor. The ramps and levers, the sand-filled trenches and controlled descents that various theories propose, all required coordination that only the most capable administrators could have managed. When the obelisks finally stood in their intended positions, their achievement represented triumphs of organization as much as engineering. The Red Chapel at Karnak, the Chapelle Rouge as later French archaeologists would name it, provided a station where Amun's sacred bark could rest during processional ceremonies that moved the god's image through the temple complex. The structure's walls of red quartzite bore reliefs whose quality matched anything Hatshepsut's artists produced, their scenes depicting rituals that the pharaoh herself performed in service to the deity whose favor her reign required. The chapel's eventual dismantling and dispersal would scatter its blocks across the site until modern reconstruction reassembled the scattered elements into coherent monument. Senmut's own tomb reflected the extraordinary position he had achieved through service that Hatshepsut's favor had rewarded. The ceiling of this subterranean chamber bore the earliest known astronomical diagram in Egyptian art. its depiction of stars and constellations demonstrating interests that extended beyond administrative competence into scientific observation. The man who had managed the construction of Djeser apparently also possessed curiosity about celestial mechanics that his tomb's decoration preserved for audiences who would study it millennia after his death. The steward's prominence invited speculation that his relationship with the pharaoh exceeded the boundaries that propriety would have permitted between sovereign and servant. Graffiti discovered in unfinished tombs depicted figures whose identification remains debated, but whose positioning suggested intimacy that the artists found noteworthy or amusing. Whether these images reflected reality, rumor, or merely the bored imagination of workers laboring in isolation, they demonstrate that contemporaries noticed the closeness between Hatshepsut and her most trusted official and found it remarkable enough to record. The Princess Neferura appeared in representations alongside Senmut with frequency that his role as her tutor explained without entirely accounting for. The intimacy that his educational responsibilities required placed him in proximity to the royal family that few non-royals could claim, his presence in images depicting the princess, reflecting relationships whose full dimensions the formal record did not capture. Whatever his feelings toward his charge, his service shaped her development through years when her mother's position made her own future uncertain. The disappearance of Senmut from the historical record around year 16 of Hatshepsut's reign raised questions that no surviving evidence answers. His name ceased appearing in new inscriptions, his ambitious second tomb remained unfinished, and his fate became a mystery that later generations would debate without resolution. Death from natural causes, disgrace resulting from overreaching ambition, retirement from positions whose demands had exhausted him. All these explanations have found advocates among scholars whose arguments reflect the evidence's inadequacy rather than its clarity. The monuments that survived his disappearance continued proclaiming the vision that his partnership with Hatshepsut had produced. The terraces of Djeser still rose against cliffs whose golden stone glowed in the light of setting suns that had illuminated them since before the pyramids existed. The obelisks at Karnak still caught the morning light that transformed their tips into flames of reflected glory. Whatever had happened to the man whose capabilities had made these achievements possible, the achievements themselves remained to testify that his service had not been in vain. Hatshepsut continued ruling after Senmut's disappearance, with a steadiness that suggested either his importance had been exaggerated or her own capabilities sufficed for challenges that his support had previously addressed. The administration he had managed continued functioning through officials whose competence his selection had ensured. The construction projects he had supervised continued toward completion under successors whose training had prepared them for responsibilities his departure had created. The pharaoh who had relied on his partnership demonstrated that she could govern without him, even if governing without him was not what she would have chosen. The structures rising across Thebes and throughout Egypt announced a reign whose accomplishments architecture would preserve long after the mortal woman who had commissioned them had passed into eternity. Stone endured where flesh failed, inscriptions survived where memory faded, and the monuments that Hatshepsut built continued speaking her name to audiences whose distance in time she could anticipate but not comprehend. The architect of immortality was achieving exactly what that title implied. Through building, she was conquering death itself, ensuring that her story would continue being told as long as her monuments remained standing to tell it. The rhythm of Hatshepsut's later reign settled into patterns whose steadiness reflected the stability that 2 decades of effective governance had established. The great building projects approached completion or continued through phases that required less direct royal attention than their initiation had demanded. The administrative systems that prosperity had refined functioned with efficiency that capable officials maintained without the constant supervision that earlier years had required. The female pharaoh who had seized power through unprecedented assertion now held it through the quieter authority that long exercise of rule had naturalized. Thutmos III had grown from the child whose theoretical kingship, Hatshepsut's regency, had managed into a young man whose capabilities were becoming increasingly apparent. The co-regent, who had been a symbol requiring female guidance, was developing into a ruler whose own ambitions and abilities would eventually reshape the empire his stepmother had preserved. The relationship between them during these later years remains one of the most debated questions in Egyptian history. Its true character obscured by the silence of sources that recorded public events without revealing private dynamics. The military training that royal princes received had prepared Thutmose for command, whose exercise his stepmother's dominance had postponed but not prevented. He led forces in campaigns whose scope remained limited, while Hatshepsut lived, but whose success demonstrated qualities that would later make him Egypt's greatest warrior pharaoh. The army that his great-grandfather had built and that Hatshepsut had maintained recognized in this young man capabilities that his predecessors had displayed, their loyalty transferring gradually toward a figure whose gender matched their expectations of what pharaohs should be. Whatever tensions may have existed between the aging female pharaoh and her increasingly capable co-regent, the sources preserve no evidence of open conflict during these years. Hatshepsut continued appearing in monuments that depicted her exercising royal authority, her position apparently secure despite the emergence of an alternative around whom opposition might have coalesced. The arrangement that had seemed temporary when a child required regency had proven durable enough to survive his maturation into adulthood. Whether this durability reflected genuine acceptance, calculated patience, or constraints that prevented action, the surface remained calm as the years accumulated. The Princess Neferure, whose prominence had suggested possible succession plans that might have continued female rule, disappeared from the historical record during this period. Her absence from later monuments and inscriptions has led scholars to conclude that she died before her mother, her passing removing a figure whose importance had extended beyond the personal relationship between mother and daughter. The title, God's Wife of Amun, that Neferure had held, represented religious authority that Hatshepsut may have intended to deploy in arrangements that death had disrupted. Whatever plans had included the princess ended with her life. The losses that accumulated during these later years reminded Hatshepsut of mortality that even pharaohs could not escape. Senmut had vanished from the record, whether through death or disgrace. Neferure had apparently preceded her mother into the afterlife. The officials who had supported her rise and sustained her rule were aging alongside their sovereign, their generation approaching the end that time imposed on all living things. The woman who had built monuments designed to last for eternity was watching the human supports of her power gradually crumble. The religious observances that had structured Hatshepsut's life from childhood continued through these twilight years, with the regularity that cosmic order required. The rituals performed at Karnak maintained the relationships between pharaoh and gods that Egyptian theology considered essential to the world's proper functioning. The festivals that marked the calendar's progression provided occasions for public appearances that connected ruler and ruled through ceremonies whose antiquity sanctified their continued performance. The female pharaoh who had claimed divine parentage continued performing the duties that such parentage implied. The mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri received its finishing touches during these years. the complex whose construction had consumed over a decade approaching the completion that would allow its ritual functions to begin. The terraces that rose against the cliffs now displayed the full program of relief decoration that Hatshepsut's artists had designed, their surfaces telling stories that would instruct visitors for millennia. The gardens planted on these terraces had matured into the green spaces their planners had envisioned, the myrrh trees from Punt producing the incense that religious ceremonies would consume in the pharaoh's honor. The tomb being prepared in the Valley of the Kings would receive Hatshepsut's body when death finally claimed her, its corridors descending into rock whose depths offered the security that royal burials required. The valley that would eventually hold the most famous pharaohs of Egyptian history was still developing as a royal necropolis during her reign, its geography of hidden tombs replacing the visible pyramids that earlier dynasties had favored. The tomb, designated K-F-20 in modern numbering, extended deep beneath the desert surface, its chambers prepared for the burial goods that would provision the pharaoh's journey through eternity. The physical body that had carried Hatshepsut through 6 decades of life was showing signs of age that royal physicians could treat but not reverse. Modern examination of her mummified remains would eventually reveal conditions that afflicted her during these final years. Bone cancer spreading through her skeleton, diabetes affecting her metabolism, an infected tooth whose abscess may have contributed to systemic illness. The woman who had ruled Egypt as pharaoh experienced the same vulnerabilities that afflicted ordinary mortals, her divine claims providing no immunity against the biological processes that time imposed on all flesh. The governance that continued during these years of physical decline maintained the standards that earlier decades had established. Provincial administrators reported to central authority with the regularity that efficient systems produced. Tax collection proceeded according to schedules that agricultural cycles determined. Construction projects that years of planning had initiated continued toward completion under supervision that the pharaoh's condition did not prevent her from exercising. The machinery of state that Hatshepsut had managed for over 2 decades continued functioning even as its operator weakened. Thutmos III's role in administration apparently expanded as Hatshepsut's capacity for direct involvement diminished, his assumption of responsibilities preparing him for the sole rule that her death would initiate. The transition that was approaching would prove smoother for having been gradual, the young pharaoh's experience accumulating through increments that years of nominal co-regency had provided. Whatever he may have felt about the woman who had dominated his early life, practical considerations encouraged cooperation that eased the transfer of power that nature was preparing to require. The court that surrounded Hatshepsut during these final years included figures whose memories would preserve impressions of a reign whose significance time would reveal. The officials who had risen through her favor, the priests whose temples had benefited from her patronage, the craftsmen whose skills had realized her vision, all would carry forward understandings of what her rule had meant that would shape how succeeding generations remembered her. The stories they told, the records they maintained, the monuments they had helped create all contributed to a legacy whose full dimensions only distance would permit observers to comprehend. The death that came around 1458 BC ended a reign whose length had exceeded what most pharaohs achieved, and whose character had defied every precedent governing what women could accomplish. Hatshepsut passed from the world of the living into the afterlife that Egyptian religion promised to those whose preparations had been adequate and whose conduct had been righteous. The rituals of mummification preserved her body for the eternal existence that awaited beyond death's threshold. The 70 days of treatment transforming mortal remains into an imperishable vessel that the soul could inhabit forever. The burial that followed placed her body in the tomb that years of preparation had readied, its chambers containing the goods that the afterlife's requirements had accumulated, the canopic jars that held her preserved organs, the shabti figures that would perform labor on her behalf in the realm of the dead, the furniture and food and precious objects that provisioned royal burials. All accompanied Hatshepsut into the darkness from which she would emerge into the eternal light that paradise provided. The sarcophagus that received her mummified remains had been carved from quartzite, whose hardness would protect its contents against the thieves, whose depredations threatened every royal burial. The images decorating its surfaces depicted the goddesses whose protection the deceased required for the journey through the underworld's dangers. Nut, the sky goddess, stretched across the lid's interior so that Hatshepsut's face would gaze upward into the divine body from which each day's sun emerged. The care lavished on these preparations demonstrated that death had not diminished the honor that her reign had earned. Thutmos III assumed sole rule with a readiness that years of preparation had ensured, his accession marking the end of an era whose peculiarity he would eventually attempt to erase. The young pharaoh who had grown up in the shadow of his stepmother's dominance now stood alone in the light that sovereignty provided. The character of his reign would differ dramatically from hers. Military campaigns replacing commercial expeditions, conquest supplementing construction, masculine assertion replacing whatever accommodation female rule had required. Egypt was entering a new phase whose aggressive energy would carry its armies further than they had ever previously marched. The monuments that Hatshepsut had raised continued standing after their builder had passed, their stone surfaces still proclaiming achievements that death could not diminish. The terraces of Deir el-Bahari still rose against cliffs whose colors shifted with the sun's daily journey across the sky. The obelisks at Karnak still caught the light that transformed their tips into flames of reflected glory. The images carved on countless walls still depicted a pharaoh whose gender had not prevented her from ruling with effectiveness that few of her predecessors had matched. The female pharaoh had joined her ancestors in the realm where Osiris ruled and re-traveled through the 12 hours of the night. Her car would receive the offerings that mortuary priests would present in the temple she had built, their service sustaining her existence through eternity, as long as rituals continued and her name was spoken. The arrangements she had made for her eternal welfare represented the culmination of a lifetime spent preparing for an afterlife, whose reality she had never doubted. Hatshepsut had built for eternity, and eternity had received her. The two lands that she left behind continued under governance that her successor would shape according to his own vision. The prosperity she had cultivated would fund campaigns whose scope exceeded anything Egypt had previously attempted. The peace she had preferred would yield to warfare whose intensity would establish Thutmos III as the Napoleon of ancient Egypt. But the foundations upon which his achievements rested had been laid during the decades when a woman held power that tradition had reserved for men, her reign providing the stability that made his conquests possible. The sun set over the western cliffs, where her temple rose in terraces toward the sanctuary, carved into living rock, its light painting the stone with colors that shifted from gold to rose to purple as darkness approached. Another day was ending, as countless days had ended before and would end after. The cosmic rhythms that Hatshepsut had served through decades of ritual observance continuing their eternal cycles, regardless of individual mortal fates. The female pharaoh had taken her place among the ancestors whose achievements her own had joined, her story becoming part of the larger story that Egypt had been telling since before the pyramids rose at Giza. The monuments that Hatshepsut had raised to proclaim her achievements for eternity stood undisturbed through the early years of Thutmose III's sole reign, their surfaces continuing to display the images and inscriptions that their builder had intended. The new pharaoh devoted his energies to the military campaigns that would establish him as Egypt's greatest warrior king, his armies marching across territories that stretched from Nubia to the Euphrates in expeditions whose frequency left little time for attending to domestic matters that did not urgently demand attention. For 2 decades after his stepmother's death, her legacy remained physically intact. The change came around year 42 of Thutmose III's reign, more than 20 years after Hatshepsut had passed into eternity. Workers received orders to remove her images from the monuments where they appeared, their tools systematically attacking surfaces that generations of craftsmen had labored to create. Cartouches bearing her name were chiseled into illegibility, the hieroglyphs that spelled Hatshepsut and Matkare, obliterated so thoroughly that later observers would struggle to reconstruct what had once been written. The faces of her statues suffered blows that destroyed features whose idealized beauty had proclaimed her divine nature. The scale of this campaign of erasure demonstrated both its official character and its systematic execution. Sites throughout Egypt received attention from workers whose instructions specified targets with precision that random vandalism could never have achieved. The terraces of Deir el-Bahri, the walls of Karnak, provincial temples where her building programs had left marks, all witnessed the removal of evidence that a female pharaoh had once ruled the two lands. The effort required to accomplish this destruction rivaled what the original construction had demanded. The obelisks at Karnak posed challenges that their massive scale made difficult to address through simple destruction. Thutmose III's solution demonstrated the same ingenuity that his military campaigns displayed. Rather than attempting to demolish shafts whose stability resisted assault, he ordered walls built around them that concealed their inscribed surfaces from view. The obelisks remained standing, their golden tips still visible above the enclosure that hid the texts proclaiming Hatshepsut's devotion to Amun. Ironically, this concealment would protect those inscriptions from the weathering that exposed surfaces suffered, their preservation owing to the very effort intended to suppress them. The statues that had depicted Hatshepsut in the regalia of pharaonic office suffered fates that ranged from mutilation to complete destruction. Some were smashed and their fragments buried in pits where discovery would await archaeologists working millennia later. Others were toppled from their positions and left where they fell, their broken pieces scattered across sites whose later development would disperse them further. The images that had proclaimed her power were being systematically eliminated from the visual environment that Egyptians inhabited. The motivations driving this campaign have generated scholarly debate whose resolution the evidence does not permit. The traditional interpretation viewed the erasure as Thutmose III's revenge against the stepmother who had usurped his rightful authority during his youth, the destruction expressing hatred that decades had not diminished. Yet the timing argues against personal animosity as the primary explanation. If Thutmose had hated Hatshepsut, why wait over 20 years to express that hatred through monument destruction? Alternative explanations focus on political and theological concerns that the passage of time had made urgent. Thutmose III was aging, his own mortality approaching, his succession requiring arrangements that would ensure smooth transition to his chosen heir, Amenhotep II. The precedent that Hatshepsut had established, a woman ruling as pharaoh, might provide justification for future female claims that could disrupt the orderly transmission of power through male lines. Eliminating evidence that such rule had occurred served purposes that forward-looking policy, rather than backward-looking revenge, might explain. The theological dimensions of kingship that Egyptian religion emphasized provided additional rationale for erasure that political calculation alone might not fully explain. The pharaoh's role in maintaining cosmic order depended upon proper performance of rituals, whose efficacy required the officiant to possess qualities that tradition associated with masculinity. A female pharaoh represented an anomaly whose memory might contaminate the theological purity that proper order required. Removing Hatshepsut from the historical record could be understood as correction rather than persecution, restoration of proper patterns rather than punishment for improper ambition. Whatever combination of motives drove the campaign, its effects transformed how subsequent generations understood their history. The king lists that recorded pharaonic succession omitted Hatshepsut's name, the years of her reign attributed instead to Thutmos III, whose sole authority was thereby extended backward to encompass the period of her dominance. Egyptians living in later centuries would have had no way of knowing that a woman had once ruled as pharaoh, the evidence that might have informed them having been systematically removed from the monuments they encountered. The sands of time accomplished what official policy had begun, their accumulation gradually burying sites whose maintenance required attention that changing circumstances no longer provided. Deir el-Bahri's terraces disappeared beneath drifts that desert winds deposited through centuries when the temple's ritual functions had ceased, and its structures no longer commanded the care that active use ensured. The colors that had brightened its walls faded beneath coatings of dust that filtered sunlight into dimness where paintings became invisible. Centuries accumulated like sediment layers, each generation further removed from the era when Hatshepsut had walked through the colonnades her vision had created. The Greek conquest brought foreigners who marveled at Egyptian antiquities without fully comprehending the civilization that had produced them. Roman tourists carved their names into temple walls, their graffiti preserving observations that sometimes provide modern scholars with useful information amid the vandalism their presence represented. The rise of Christianity transformed temples into churches, their ancient imagery plastered over or defaced by adherents of a faith that considered such images idolatrous. The Arab conquest brought new rulers whose relationship to pharaonic heritage differed from what previous occupiers had displayed. The monuments became quarries for building materials, their carefully dressed stones recycled into structures whose builders valued utility over preservation. The knowledge that had allowed Egyptians to read their ancestors' writing faded into complete loss, the hieroglyphs becoming mysterious symbols whose meaning no living person could comprehend. Hatshepsut's name, where it survived the ancient erasure, became unreadable to all who encountered it. The European rediscovery of ancient Egypt began processes whose continuation would eventually restore Hatshepsut to the historical awareness from which deliberate policy and natural processes had removed her. Napoleon's expedition brought scholars alongside soldiers, their documentation of monuments initiating systematic study that would develop into the discipline of Egyptology. Jean-François Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphics in 1822 provided the key that would unlock texts whose meanings had been lost for over a millennium. The Rosetta Stone enabling readings that transformed mysterious symbols into comprehensible language. The excavations that followed decipherment gradually revealed evidence that something unusual had occurred during the early 18th dynasty. The erasures that had removed Hatshepsut's name had left traces that careful examination could detect. Ghostly outlines where cartouches had been chiseled away. Grammatical inconsistencies where feminine forms had been imperfectly altered to masculine. Broken statues whose fragments preserved features that destruction had not entirely erased. Scholars began reconstructing a story that ancient efforts had attempted to suppress. Edouard Naville's excavations at Deir el-Bahri between 1893 and 1906 revealed the full magnificence of Hatshepsut's mortuary temple beneath the sand and debris that centuries had deposited. The terraces emerged from their burial into sunlight they had not seen for over 1,000 years, their colonnades and reliefs gradually becoming visible as workers removed the accumulation that had hidden them. The Punt expedition scenes that decorated the lower colonnade astonished observers with their narrative sophistication and ethnographic detail. The distant land they depicted suddenly vivid after millennia of obscurity. Howard Carter, before his famous discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, conducted excavations in the Valley of the Kings that located Hatshepsut's burial site in Cave 20. The tomb's contents had suffered the looting that afflicted virtually every royal burial in the valley, its treasures scattered by thieves whose depredations had occurred in antiquity. The sarcophagus remained, its massive quartzite form too heavy for removal, but the body it should have contained was missing. The female pharaoh's mummy had been moved at some point, its new location unknown. The search for Hatshepsut's physical remains extended across decades of investigation that modern technology would eventually resolve. A mummy discovered in tomb K 60 had long been considered a possible candidate, its position and context suggesting royal status whose specific identification remained uncertain. The body of a large woman, positioned with one arm folded across her chest in the manner reserved for royalty, awaited definitive identification that earlier methods could not provide. The breakthrough came in 2007 when a team led by Zahi Hawass applied DNA analysis and CT scanning to the question of Hatshepsut's identification. A tooth preserved in a wooden box bearing her cartouche provided the key. Scanning revealed that this tooth, part of her mummification equipment, precisely matched a gap in the jaw of the KV-60 mummy. DNA testing confirmed the identification by establishing family relationships consistent with Hatshepsut's known genealogy. The female pharaoh had been found, her physical remains finally reunited with her historical identity. The examination of her mummy revealed details about her final years that texts had not preserved. The bone cancer whose spread had affected her skeleton, the diabetes whose systemic effects had weakened her body, the tooth infection whose abscess may have caused or contributed to her death. These conditions emerged from analysis that transformed an anonymous body into a specific individual whose health challenges could be understood with clinical precision. The woman who had ruled Egypt as pharaoh became visible not just through her monuments, but through the physical evidence of her mortal existence. Modern understanding recognizes Hatshepsut as one of ancient Egypt's most successful rulers. Her gender transformed from disqualifying liability into distinguishing characteristic that makes her story particularly compelling. The peace and prosperity that her reign provided, the architectural achievements that her vision produced, the administrative competence that her governance displayed, all demonstrate capabilities that matched or exceeded what male pharaohs typically achieved. The erasure that attempted to remove her from history failed. Her story recovered and celebrated by audiences vastly larger than those who had known her during her lifetime. The temple at Deir el-Bahri stands restored as one of ancient Egypt's most visited monuments, its terraces receiving tourists whose numbers exceed anything Hatshepsut could have imagined when she planned the structure's construction. The colonnades that shade visitors from the desert sun rise against cliffs whose colors still shift through daily cycles that have continued since before human beings walked the earth. The reliefs that decorate its walls still tell stories that Hatshepsut commissioned artists to create, their narratives preserved across 35 centuries of human history. The cliffs glow golden in the last light of setting suns that have illuminated them through ages beyond counting, their stone bearing witness to everything that has occurred in the valley below since the Nile first carved its course through the landscape. Hatshepsut's terraces rise against this backdrop of geological time, with a permanence that approaches what her builders intended, their survival demonstrating that human achievement can endure beyond the brief spans that individual lives encompass. The female pharaoh built for eternity, and eternity has vindicated her ambition. The woman who was foremost of noble women became foremost among pharaohs, her story carved into stone that has survived every attempt at suppression. The daughter of Thutmos I claimed a throne that no woman had previously held, and held it with distinction that few rulers of any gender have matched. The architect of immortality achieved exactly what that title promised. Through building, she conquered death itself, ensuring that her name would be spoken and her story told as long as humanity retained interest in the civilizations that preceded it. The Nile continues flowing past Thebes, as it has flowed since before the pyramids were built, its waters still bringing the life that makes Egypt possible. The desert sun still rises over the eastern hills and sets behind the western cliffs, where the dead have been laid to rest since the earliest dynasties. The cosmic rhythms that Hatshepsut served through decades of ritual observance continue their eternal cycles, indifferent to individual mortal fates, yet somehow honored by achievements that approach their timelessness. The female pharaoh rests among her ancestors, her monument still standing, her story still being told, her place in history finally secure against all who would deny it. The stars that wheel overhead through Egyptian nights traced paths that Senmut recorded on his tomb ceiling over 34 centuries ago, their movements unchanged by everything that has occurred on the earth beneath them since that astronomical diagram was painted. Somewhere in that vast expanse of time and space, the achievements of a woman who refused to accept the limitations her world imposed upon her gender retain significance that neither erasure nor oblivion could extinguish. Hatshepsut built for eternity, and eternity, it seems, was paying attention.